this morning, hearing all your projects. It was great to hear what you've done, so I'm really happy that I can be here and contribute. My contribution is, first of all, perhaps I say the title, Trauma and Silence in Migration, Lessons for Politics, the Media and the General Public. Now, I don't concentrate on museums, I don't concentrate on film, mine is about literature. It's another form of exhibiting stories, using a specific form of telling these stories that are not easy to tell. And migrants have often used literature to tell their stories of migration, because of course it's much easier to write a book than to make a film or to have an exhibition. Trauma and the resultant silence have been very important topics in their works, and I will talk about two authors and selected works of theirs, Vladimir, Vertlib and Julya Rabinowich, and their take on trauma, silence and migration, and then I'll look at lessons for politics, the media and the general public. So, silence as the voice of trauma. I want to start by saying a few words about what is trauma and how is it linked to silence. Now, Sigmund Freud, very early in the late 19th century, in 1896, described trauma as a void in a letter to a friend, Wilhelm Fleiss. And this idea that trauma as an empty space has been taken up since in many research, in quite a lot of research, and Kathy Carroll is an important researcher on the topic, who said, and I quote, "Trauma is a gap that carries the force of the event and does so precisely at the expense of simple knowledge and memory." So the event that led to trauma leaves a trace, but the trace is not the memory of the event, but the absence of the event, and that is an important point. So this is the reason why silence can be described as the voice of trauma, as Maria Ritter did in an article. She says, and I quote, "Silence is the common denominator found among all victims, signifying a state of survival functioning where words fail, and verbal recollections may have destroyed a fragile ego. Silence in response to massive trauma constitutes also a self-protective, self-imposed firewall to avoid total psychic fragmentation." So Ritter describes silence as a result of trauma because words fail and the person cannot narrate what has happened, at least not in the sense of a coherent story. At the same time, this silence is also a form of self-protection, a self-imposed firewall. And these are exactly the things that we find in Vertlib's and Rabinowich novels. So I'll talk a little bit now how they put this voice of trauma, the silence as the voice of trauma, into words in their novels. And I'll start with Vladimir Vertlib. Vertlib is an established Austrian writer of Russian Jewish origin. Of the 11 books he has published thus far, 3 have been based on his migration experiences. He was born in Leningrad in 1966, and around this time his parents became involved in an illegal Zionist movement that opposed the Soviet ban on emigration to Israel. They suffered from repression, especially when they applied for immigration to Israel. And in 1971, the family was finally permitted to leave the country, and they had to travel via Austria. That was, at the time, they were not allowed to travel directly to Israel, so all the migration at that time went via neutral Austria to Israel, but many of them did not stay in Israel and then went on a long journey, and that is what happened in this case. They had a 10-year-long odyssey, so they started in Israel, went back to Vienna, went to Boston, went to Amsterdam, went to Rome, so it was a long process of endless migrations before they finally settled in Vienna after they were deported from the United States in 1981. So that was the last stage of the journey. Vertlib began to explore the danger of speech and the habitus of silence in his literary works in the early 1990s, and his debut was Abschiebung, which is called in English is Deportation, and that was published in 1995. This deals with the deportation of a Russian Jewish family from the United States to Germany, and the trauma is of course the moment of the deportation, but it's also for the young boy who's the protagonist, the fact that he actually told the migration officers why they were in the United States. So he feels responsible for the fact that the family was deported, and he erases this from his memory, and this novel is about how this is kind of dug up and found again in the memory of the person. The second book, Zwischenstationen, Transit Stations, was published in 1999, and this book relates the 10-year-long odyssey of a Russian Jewish family in search of a home. And in this long process, the son learns from his parents what I call the habitus of silence. So this is actually the transfer of a trauma onto the son, who learns to be silent in the places where he lives. Both texts draw on the author's own experiences, but they shouldn't be misread as telling solely about an individual fate. Rather, they reveal societal mechanisms that silence refugees and illegalized immigrants, and that cement their exclusion. They portray how silence becomes a strategy against the fear of a world whose deep-seated and horrible hostility never sleeps. And that's a quotation from Didier Arrivant, La Société comme Vertlib. This fear, he continues, urges all those whose stigma is not visible to hide it. And stigma here, of course, is the Jewish heritage, but also the Russian heritage, the fact that you're a migrant, the fact that you're illegal, etc. It's something you can hide, but of course when you're black and there's racism in the country, this stigma cannot be hidden. So one of the consequences of the silence is that the host society learns little about what it means to be illegal or to be a refugee, and has little understanding when finally the people start to speak. So, inheriting silence, how does that work? And this is a central element of both of the novels I just mentioned. In the Vertlib's debut, Deportation, we learn that silence, as a protective mechanism, has a long history in the family. The young protagonist is the descendant of two Jewish families whose ancestors were murdered in the Holocaust, and the very few photos they had and the artifacts they had were then destroyed in at the anti-Semitic height of at the height of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. So nothing is left, no memories are left. And the protagonist's parents have inherited this trauma from their ancestors. It is the father's paranoia that explains why the family has to constantly leave the place where they live. And furthermore, their anti-Semitic experience in the Soviet Union have taught them to keep silence about the past and the fact that they are Jews. The novel Transit Stations tells the story of how this habitus of silence is transferred to the next generation. The young protagonist learns from his parents to hide his roots, but unlike his parents, this is not only about his Jewish heritage. So in the process of migration, the idea of what has to be silenced, what is the trauma, changes. For him, silence becomes a mechanism of protection in migration. And I will give you one example of how he learns from his mother that speech is silver, but silence is golden. And this is the sentence she says when he's 6 years old. And this happens because the mother has a conflict with her boss in Austria, where they reside now after the third migration. So the mother is a mathematician, she speaks perfect German, but of course because she's Russian, she doesn't get a job, so she works as a cleaning woman. And her Austrian boss savors her little bit of power over the foreigners who are her subordinates. And she emphasizes her superiority by speaking a pidgin German to the cleaning women. Now the mother silently accepts her boss's racist behavior, but the boy inadvertently questions her power when he asks why she uses incorrect German. So the cleaning woman gets very angry, and the boss demands that his mother should not be allowed to bring her son anymore to work. And that, of course, is a massive problem for the family because they rely on the work of the mother. It's the only income they have at that time, and without that income they couldn't survive. And that is why the mother teaches her son the first lesson in silence. Speech is silver, but silence is golden. So he has to learn not to question the majority. He has to accept the derogatory behavior of the native population in order to survive in a society that rejects migration. It takes him several years to accept this, but when they finally end up in the United States as illegal immigrants, he fully understands the importance of silence, and I quote, "Few people know that my parents and I lived in Israel and Austria. No one is allowed to know that we came to America on a tourist visa, let alone that we bought it. My father told me that if I told anyone, we would all go to jail, but first he would tear my head off." So silence becomes very, very important in this very moment when they are illegal in the United States. So all of this leads to what I call a vicious circle of silence. The protagonists themselves, it's not like the protagonists don't want to speak. They want to speak to their friends about what is happening. However, when they break the silence, it's quite obvious that nobody understands what they are talking about. So there is a scene in the first novel, in Deportation, that illustrates this vicious circle of silence. When the young protagonist tells his friend in the United States that they are illegal in this country, and that his family will be deported, his friend is of course very sad to see him go, but he doesn't show any further interest in what is actually happening. And again, I quote, "He was sorry that I had to leave, but otherwise he was completely uninterested in my fate, and even more so in the circumstances in which our family had found itself, because he didn't really understand a word. How could he?" And this is important. The protagonist's friend cannot link his own story to the reality of the protagonist. All that counts in his young life is the latest musical trend and his newest love object. So he doesn't spend his days translating documents for his parents, ringing immigration offices to get an appointment, or asking consulates for support. This whole world is completely foreign to him. He cannot make sense of what his friends is telling him. So that is why he remains silent the moment the story of the protagonist ends. So Vertlib's works provide insight into a vicious circle of silence that explains why it is so difficult to overcome the societal lack of knowledge about immigration. Illegalized immigrants and refugees do not dare to speak. This leads to a lack of knowledge even among their closest friends, who do not understand what they have to say when they finally decide to speak. So what are the lessons to be learned? First of all, I think the most important point is that you need to create an atmosphere in which migrants dare to speak. And I compare this to anti-Semitism because with regard to anti-Semitism, we have many policies that prohibit anti-Semitism, we have a reporting on anti-Semitism in Austria. There's also education at school on anti-Semitism, and all this doesn't happen on migrants, especially not on illegalized migrants. So I think this is absolutely important that policies are put into place that prohibit anti-migrant mobilization and that implement measures against xenophobia and racism. Second point is we need to provide platforms for migrants to make themselves heard. And this could be in newspapers, in magazines, where we can facilitate the publication of their stories, of their writing, but also support literature, films, etc. made by migrants and their descendants. And then, third point, very important, we have to listen to what they have to say. And this is not as easy as it sounds, because I can say with the very first novel that Vertlib wrote, that actually the critics didn't understand a word of what he was talking about. They thought, oh, he's talking about deportation, that's not really that interesting, but unfortunately he's also talking about family life. And I was like, how can they think deportation is not an interesting story? Well, because they didn't know anything about deportation and just thought, well, has got nothing to do with my life as the boy in the story. And finally, we need to spread the word, so talk about the novels, the films, etc., so that they actually raise the awareness of what is going on. And with this, I move to the second author, Julya Rabinowich. She has a very similar migration history to Vertlib. She was born into a Jewish family in Leningrad in 1970 and fled from the Soviet Union with her parents and grandmother when she was 7 years old. Now, trauma and silence were at the center of her writing from her very first publication, Spaltkopf, and this one is also available in English, Split Head. Her debut uses a very convincing narrative form to describe how trauma works in individuals, how events are repressed, and how they come back to haunt the people. She invents the figure of the split head, and this figure is the one who tells the repressed story. So the people themselves cannot tell the story, but this split head is the one talking about what happened. In the novel, a woman uncovers the trauma haunting her family and herself. The protagonist's great-grandfather was murdered in a pogrom, and her grandmother witnessed the murder of her father, and she has been traumatized ever since. But the rest of the family, especially the young protagonist, they do not know that this happened. This only becomes clear at the end of the novel when the grandmother dies and she tells the story. Now she transfers the trauma to the protagonist's mother, who denies her Jewish roots and does not explain to the protagonist that she is Jewish or what it actually means that she is Jewish. Then the family flees from the Soviet Union to Austria, and this migration, again, like for Vertlib, changes the trauma in the next generation. So the young girl leaves behind her first love, a Russian boy who never responds to her letters. And she does not know that this silence is due to her being Jewish, because she does not know what it means. So what she does, she cuts off her Russian roots because of her anger with this boy, and pretends she was never Russian. There's this sentence where she says, there were times when I didn't even remember that I was born in Russia. So Split It then is a novel about overcoming traumatic silence and turning the trauma into a narrative to make the traumatic event part of individual memory, but also of collective memory, of course, by sharing it with the audience. This third novel of Rabinowich is the opposite. The Earth Eater is a novel about a character who denies her trauma, and in the end she dies. Central to the novel is the idea that we cannot differentiate between economic migrants and refugees. On one level, the novel tells the story of an economic migrant, a woman called Diana from the Russian Republic of Dagestan, who has entered the European Union illegally to work in Vienna as a sex worker and to finance the lives of her mother, her sister, and her sixth son back home. But the exhausting job and the fact that she's constantly under threat of deportation lead to a nervous breakdown. She receives psychological treatment, but the fact that nobody can help her in her desperate situation ultimately lead to her death. At the same time, this story of an economic migrant is also a story about a member of a persecuted minority. Diana, the protagonist, was present when her Jewish father was killed, but she has suppressed the memory of this traumatic experience. This implies that she cannot tell this story because she's not aware of it herself. So the trauma prevents her from claiming her right to asylum. The economic migrant who dies is in fact a refugee who did not receive the support granted by the Refugee Convention. Now, how does the author do that? How does she write these two stories at the same time? The novel is intentionally written in a style that makes it difficult to grasp the suppressed trauma of the protagonist. And this is meant to show us how difficult it is to identify a trauma in a person and how easily we fall for the story that the person tells us instead. and then how easily we may condemn a person to illegal status, although the person is a refugee and has right to asylum. Now, what she uses to do this is a form of a palimpsest. So you read on the superficial level, you read one story, but below that there's the second story hidden in the text. And I'll show you one example. Mother was mopping our doorstep with her bare hands, even in the freezing cold. Her skin cracked and popped, little red lines in the dark brown. The fingernails red and the fingers. She washed the doorstep every day to keep it clean and fresh for father, so that when he returned, he would find a cozy home. So here, it's the daughter, the protagonist, telling the story about her mother who cleans the doorstep because she wants it to be clean for the father to come back. But the image also includes the unconscious traces of the traumatic event, the murder of the father on the doorstep. And this is done with the color red, the red lines and the dark brown, the red fingernails and nails, and she links this to the cold, but in fact, the red color is the blood. So the mother cleaning the doorstep is a compulsive disorder. She cleans the doorstep to clean away the blood that was there every day again and again and again, and to convince herself that this murder never happened. Now at some stage, as I said, the protagonist has a nervous breakdown and she's taken to a hospital and has psychotherapy, but even the therapist doesn't manage to get her to tell the story. He gets very close. There's this moment where she is in this room and she really doesn't want to talk. So she says, I have to go to the toilet, and he says, no, you stay. And then she pees on the floor and the session is over. So there is this long story of trying to get the story out, but it doesn't happen. So the novel successfully shows how difficult it is to identify that a person has a trauma and that the event behind the trauma may make the person eligible for refugee status. So what lessons are to be learned here? Asylum procedures demand that people tell a story of the persecution in a logical narrative that makes sense to those judging their case. But in fact, it is exactly this kind of storytelling that is difficult, if not impossible, for a traumatized person. So the EU member states may be breaking the Refugee Convention on a daily basis without even realizing it. What could help? Well, my lessons to be learned is, I think, in every asylum procedure, a therapist should be involved, and we need to raise the awareness of what trauma means among those deciding on refugee status. Just a few final thoughts on the question of the political relevance of literature. I think that literature can tell stories that are very difficult to tell. Silence is not something that is easy to capture in interviews. How can you talk about mechanisms of silence if you are silenced yourself? Vertlib, for example, tells the long story of how he uncovered his own traumatic stories and how difficult it was for him to understand these mechanisms that silenced him. But literature can move beyond the silence and uncover the mechanisms that lead to the silencing of migrants. Literary forms also lend themselves to make people understand how trauma works and how it affects the lives not only of those traumatized, but also of their families. As such, it has much more than informative value. It demands changes not only in how migrants are perceived in politics and the media, but also in concrete legal and administrative procedures, such as the recognition of refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting keynote. I have some questions, of course, but I think I leave it to you to ask the first ones. Just shortly introduce yourself.
So my name is Nan from the Edmund Institute, and thank you. It was very interesting. Very interesting. I had a question regarding the first author, where you mentioned silence as a protective mechanism for trauma. Today, what do you believe is the impact of globalization and social media on silence as a protective mechanism?
In what sense?
If I'm not mistaken, you said these books were written in the 90s. And when you go through a certain trauma, today it is easier, I would think, to connect with other people having similar traumas, making it possibly easier, not easier, but yeah, to connect and to express yourself. What do you think about that? What is that effect of globalization, of social media on silence as a protective mechanism?
I'm not sure it changes things completely, because in fact, if you don't want to talk about something, why should you talk about it on the social media? You know, if you don't want to, I think refugees know that their social media accounts are checked, for example. When you enter Austria as a refugee, the first thing they take from you is your mobile phone, to check where you were, where you went, etc. So all the things that you do on your mobile phone can actually tell the story of where you were, what you did, and whether you tell them the truth. So in a way, I think the idea of hiding what has happened to you, it has not vanished. It may even have become worse, because there are many things you cannot tell, especially on social media where you want to exchange with friends. So I'm not sure it makes things any better if you have to hide and if you don't want people to know what happened. I mean, the people who speak here, two authors who have legal status, even if they have illegal status at some stage, but now they are Austrians, they are citizens, so they can speak up. It's something completely different from being an illegal migrant. You wouldn't write such a novel.
I have two questions, and they might not be very clear, so apologies in advance. The first question is, you talk about silence as a protective mechanisms of the psychic to protect, let's say, the integrity of our psychic being. My question is, in the authors that you've described, what was their motivation to break the silence? What is the moment where the silence is no longer protective but becomes a hindrance? And my second question is, what it tells of our society maybe that certain rights are given just to people on the account of their trauma. On the account of their trauma, if they can manage to prove that they've been traumatized as a refugee and asylum seekers, that this is the only accepted reasons for asking for help, actually.
Perhaps with regard to the first question, the authors, when they started writing, as I said, had a secure status. And Vladimir has actually written a third novel based on his migration experiences, and that I call that his portrait of a young artist, because it's in a way telling the story of how somebody who's been silent all the time suddenly speaks up. And it's of course because of racism, because of not being expected, and you speak perfect German, you studied, you have the highest status in the country, and still, when you meet somebody who wants to sell you an apartment, they start talking about how you're a stranger and you're not on the same level. So this idea that you can be as good, you can fulfill all the things that you're asked to do, you will never be accepted. I think that was the starting point to say, I want to speak up, I don't want to remain silent, I don't want to this to continue, but I want this to be a country that accepts that it is a country of migration. So that was the reason for him. I think it's similar for Julya Rabinowich. It's a bit more personal, I think, in her case. So it's her very personal story that she starts with. And she was really shocked how everybody kind of then started talking about this being a personal story. So the other novel I talked about, The Earth Eater, she was a translator in psychotherapy sessions with refugees. And this whole story comes from these psychotherapy sessions. So that's also where she learned how trauma works, and where she saw refugees talking, coming up with traumatic events. She said, you can see how the whole body changes, how everything changes in the person, and how suddenly somebody else seems to speak out of them. And that's how she invented the split head, this idea of there is something in you that speaks about this traumatic event, but you cannot do it, you cannot speak it. And the interesting thing is, I just read recently that in fact in the 1970s in Germany it was still quite normal that you could claim refugee status without having to explain that you were actually persecuted. So you didn't have to prove it. You just turned up and said, I don't know, a minority from wherever, I'm persecuted, and they accepted it. And then only, the problem is of course now you have to prove it. This is one of the problems. I'm not sure whether it would be enough to say the trauma is there, but it should perhaps be enough to say I'm a persecuted minority, or I'm part of a minority that is persecuted in a certain country. You don't then need to prove that actually somebody tried to kill your parents or whatever. I think that should be enough. But as we know, I'm not sure that is easy to get through, but it used to be the case. It's not like it didn't exist.
Other questions? Søren and then Lydia.
Yeah, it's to follow up on the question from before. And I was just wondering how important it is when talking about fictional literature or semi-fiction, where the backstories come from for the readers, or how they are received, these books and these stories. How important is it that the author actually has personal experience or knows through translation or whatever where the stories come from? How much is that in play when people react to the fictional literature?
It's very much in play, and that is very much a problem. I mean, on the one hand, of course, there is the importance that people themselves speak up. I think that was something mentioned several times here as well. I want to tell my story in my own way rather than somebody else telling my story at a moment in time where I'm still not recognized as an equal citizen here in the country. So this is an important element. At the same time, that this idea that this was Vertlib's personal story. He told this story in the early 1990s. Nobody before him had written about migration in Austria. So this was the very first book. And what happens is, of course, that everybody says, yeah, this is an individual fate. It's not relevant to us as Austrians. It's not relevant beyond his individual story. And that's, of course, the big problem, that you kind of take the person, think it's an individual story, whereas when an Austrian tells you this story, this has to say something about Austria or perhaps even about the world. So this reduction to this being just a personal story has been a massive problem. It took a while before somebody realized, well, in fact, he's talking about migration and we have more than one migrant in the country. That took a while, and it took much longer, and I think we're not there yet. In fact, he's got something to say about Austria. So this moment of what do we do with the story that is being told and how do we reject it, that is happening all the time.
Yes, my question was very similar to the previous one. Actually, I was wondering what was the reaction, the public reaction, and were there any critical interpretations about those books, but at the same time now you answered that Austrians were selective about it because it was written by an outsider. But then have they lost so quickly that historic notion that they actually are inhabited by so many Czechs, Slovaks, and I mean Vienna is full of newcomers. Not quite fresh, but maybe half a century old newcomers. So has it been lost so quickly?
Well, I mean, you have, of course, historians who work on that. You have literary studies who take this up, but you don't, I mean, the general public does not generally think about the fact that they have all these roots and that they are a very diverse country. I mean, it's something that has been brought up then afterwards, because migration as an issue only really came up in the 1990s. It's not like there was no migration, but it's just that it was not discussed in public. So when he started writing, people just didn't know very much about what he was talking about. They didn't understand. And it's also, I mean, that's also something described in his novels, how people reject the stories. There's a strong feeling of, I don't want to know this because this may be related to my racism. So perhaps if I don't listen, then I don't have to deal with this, that it's my story. So this happens a lot. Another problem is, of course, that there are these critics who pretend that migrants, when they tell their own stories, they're very lucky that they have these wonderful stories, but in fact the literature is not as good as the literature of the Austrians. So they only profit from the fact that they have good stories. And Rabinowich, Julya Rabinowich, in fact, wrote several novels that do not deal with migration, and with that she got the label, okay, she can also write not about migration. But what happened then is like she was taken as, okay, she's a good writer, but all the others are not. So this happens still quite a lot, that this is not accepted as good literature, and it's also not analyzed as good literature.
Similar as female feminist writers.
Yeah. Same thing, absolutely, same thing.
Any other questions? And we are round off soon, so we have one here, and then you get the last word before I give the microphone to you.
I thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if you think that the society is ready, for example, to introduce mental health help through the asylum procedures, or because it seems to me sometimes that the people that are leading this kind of interview are not really into mental health issues, either for themselves. So I was wondering. Thank you.
I think the society is not ready. You're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Austria, but of course they are not interested in having more refugees. It's very anti-migrant, very anti-refugee. So there is a dialogue or basically a political debate about how we get rid of migrants rather than how can we help migrants. So I don't think the society is ready for any of this. Also, I mean, a friend of mine wrote about these asylum procedures, and it's very clear that what these officers do is dehumanize the migrants. So in a way, you pretend in front of you is an object, and you need to get the right bits out of this object in order to be able to say yes or no. And this objectification is the worst part of it. So, but I think without doing that, they wouldn't be able to do what they do. I mean, basically, they are supposed to get many no's and very few yes. So